Thomas, a highly successful corporate executive deeply entrenched in the relentless financial world, arrived at his sprawling estate in the affluent town of Greenwich, Connecticut, feeling utterly exhausted after enduring a grueling 14-hour workday. As he stepped through the grand double doors of his impeccably decorated mansion, he anticipated the usual hollow, echoing silence that greeted him every single evening. Instead, he was met with a scene that completely defied his logical, business-oriented mind, finding two young children dancing energetically on the priceless Persian rug in the center of the massive living room. Sitting gracefully on the plush velvet sofa was Jessica, the quiet woman he employed to clean his home, gently strumming an acoustic guitar while still wearing her crisp black and white maid uniform. Leaning casually against the towering dark mahogany bookcase was Vincent, his trusted personal driver, watching the entire unfolding scene with a calm, peaceful expression that suggested this beautiful anomaly was a perfectly normal part of their daily routine. A sudden sharp wave of discomfort rose in Thomas's chest, because no one had even noticed he had entered his own home, prompting him to shift his weight awkwardly and cause his heavy leather briefcase to slip fully from his grasp. The loud, dry thud of the leather striking the polished hardwood floor shattered the delicate acoustic music, finally causing all four heads to snap rapidly in his direction. The little blonde girl wearing a delicate imported white lace dress was his daughter Sarah, and the absolute moment she saw him, she stopped dancing, her face breaking into a massive, radiant smile. She sprinted across the expansive room with her small arms wide open, screaming with absolute delight that her father had finally come home from the city. Thomas instinctively dropped to one knee to catch her, feeling her comforting small weight crash against his chest, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating corporate deals he navigated all day long. Meanwhile, the little boy, who was dressed in a pair of faded but meticulously clean denim overalls, froze entirely in the center of the vast room, staring at Thomas with wide, terrified eyes. Jessica practically dropped the acoustic guitar onto the soft sofa cushions, leaping to her feet, with a bright red flush spreading rapidly across her cheeks and her eyes wide with sheer panic. Her hands trembled violently as she desperately tried to smooth out the wrinkles in her uniform, her voice shaking uncontrollably as she stammered out a string of frantic apologies for her behavior. Thomas immediately raised his hand firmly, signaling for her to stop speaking, because he had absolutely no desire to hear desperate excuses in that particular moment. He only wanted to fully understand what on earth was happening in his usually quiet, intensely isolated household, completely mesmerized by the sudden injection of vibrant life. Sarah pressed her warm cheek against the collar of his expensive tailored suit and whispered softly that the boy, whose name was David, was her brand-new best friend and had come to play because she was unbearably lonely again. Those innocent words struck Thomas like a brutal physical blow to the stomach, forcing him to confront the agonizing reality that his daughter spent the vast majority of her childhood entirely alone in this giant house. He had spent the last several years working relentlessly to maintain his massive business empire immediately after his ex-wife had walked out the door without a single backward glance. She had left behind nothing but a chillingly cold letter stating she was simply not cut out for motherhood, granting him full uncontested custody of their only child and leaving him completely shattered. Hearing his daughter confess her profound loneliness forced him to suddenly realize that his financial provision was a terrible substitute for actual emotional presence. He looked closely at the little boy, who remained frozen in place, judging that David could not be more than 5 or 6 years old, exactly the same age as his own daughter. The boy's worn denim overalls and simple beige cotton shirt stood in harsh, glaring contrast to the hundreds of dollars worth of delicate lace Sarah was wearing, highlighting a profound socioeconomic divide. Yet Thomas felt a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest, realizing that mere seconds ago, these two vastly different children had been dancing together with absolute joy, completely oblivious to the massive differences in their backgrounds. Jessica took a hesitant step forward, her hands still shaking uncontrollably, and spoke in a fragile, hushed tone, desperately promising that she could explain the entire highly unusual situation. She was clearly bracing herself to be fired right there on the spot, in front of her terrified son, anticipating the cold wrath of her wealthy employer. She confessed that David was her biological son, and she had been forced to bring him to the estate because the elderly woman who usually watched him had fallen severely ill that very morning. Jessica explained that she absolutely could not afford to miss a single day of work, especially since Thomas had explicitly ordered her to deep clean the entire mansion before an important corporate dinner scheduled for the following evening. She swore she had ordered the boy to remain perfectly silent in the back utility room, but Sarah had heard them arrive and practically begged for David to come out and play with her. Vincent stepped forward, placing a warm, comforting hand on Jessica's trembling shoulder, firmly assuring his boss that she was a flawlessly dedicated worker, and promising this breach of protocol would never happen again. Thomas listened to the desperate explanation, feeling an incredibly heavy weight settle into his stomach, as the stark reality of her incredibly difficult daily struggles finally became fully apparent. Thomas, however, was barely processing Vincent's defensive words because his mind was entirely occupied by the shocking realization that this woman had been working in his home for 10 months, and he had never once bothered to ask if she had a family. He had completely ignored her fundamental humanity, viewing her only as a necessary mechanism to keep his massive house functioning, and this sudden epiphany sent a sharp, painful wave of deep shame radiating through his entire body. Sarah quickly wiggled out of her father's arms and ran back over to David, grabbing his small, trembling hand with surprising force and pleading with her father not to send her new friend away. She desperately explained that Jessica played the most beautiful music on the guitar, that David knew how to tell incredibly funny stories, and that she simply could not bear the thought of going back to being isolated. Thomas looked at the quiet boy, noting how David's fingers tightly intertwined with Sarah's, while his anxious eyes darted to his weeping mother, displaying a fierce, protective maturity. Thomas gently asked Jessica exactly how long she had been commuting to work at his massive estate, prompting her to blink rapidly in profound confusion before quietly answering that she had been employed there for 10 months. He nodded slowly, absorbing the information before asking if in all that considerable time he had ever once stopped to ask a single question about her personal life, her family, or her well-being. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but found absolutely no words, eventually just shaking her head in a slow, negative motion that made the heavy silence in the grand living room feel even more profound. Thomas quietly asked her where the boy's father was watching Jessica's face, drain of all remaining color, as she stared down at the expensive rug, and whispered that the man had completely abandoned them when she was 4 months pregnant. That tragic admission gripped Thomas's heart like a vice mirroring his own painful history of abandonment, allowing him to deeply understand the crushing, suffocating weight of trying to raise a child entirely alone. Sarah tugged insistently on David's hand again, her bright eyes locked onto her father as she begged him to let the boy stay for dinner, solemnly promising she would eat every single one of her hated vegetables if he agreed. On any other normal day, Thomas would have immediately declined, strictly enforcing the rigid boundaries and household rules he believed were absolutely necessary to maintain a disciplined, orderly environment. However, looking at the brilliant, uncontainable smile on his daughter's face, observing the lingering fear in David's eyes, and witnessing Jessica's desperate attempt to hold her dignity together, he knew the rules absolutely had to change. He abruptly asked Jessica how much she was currently being paid each month, prompting her to look up in shock and stammer out that she earned merely $2,000 for her exhaustive labor. Thomas quickly did the mental math, factoring in the exorbitant cost of rent, groceries, transportation, and childcare in a notoriously wealthy area like Greenwich, realizing with absolute certainty that she was living in a state of constant, suffocating financial panic. Without hesitating for another second, Thomas firmly announced that starting the very next morning, her salary would be immediately increased to $4,000, causing Jessica's green eyes to widen in absolute breathless shock. She instinctively began to protest, shaking her head, and insisting that she had done absolutely nothing to deserve such a massive amount of charity from her employer, her voice wavering heavily with sheer disbelief. Thomas gently cut her off, stating with absolute conviction that she did far more than was ever expected of her, and his only regret was that he had been entirely too blind to recognize her immense value much sooner. He then shifted his gaze down to the quiet little boy, still holding his daughter's hand, and asked David in a soft, encouraging tone if he knew how to play soccer, prompting the boy to shyly nod. Thomas smiled warmly, informing the boy that there was a brand-new soccer ball sitting entirely unused in the massive backyard, suggesting the two children go outside and play a game while the adults finished their intense conversation. The children vanished into the fading afternoon sunlight, leaving the three adults standing in the center of the vast living room, enveloped in a heavy, emotionally charged silence that Thomas knew he had to navigate very carefully. Jessica stood frozen in place, her hands tightly clasped in front of her stomach, as fresh, uncontrollable tears streamed down her face, rendering her completely unable to speak. Despite her desperate attempts to form words, Thomas slowly closed the distance between them, speaking in the gentlest tone he could muster, assuring her that she never had to fear losing her job again, because she was the absolute finest employee he had ever hired. He offered a profound, sincere apology for his months of arrogant blindness, expressing deep regret for never taking the time to ask about her genuine needs, her daily struggles, or the harsh reality of her life outside his mansion walls. Jessica's voice broke completely as she choked out that she was 2 full months behind on her rent, and she had spent the last several weeks entirely paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of sudden homelessness. Vincent stepped forward to place a comforting hand on her shoulder, and Thomas instantly realized that his quiet driver had likely known about this desperate struggle all along, and had probably been helping her in secret to fiercely protect her privacy. In that exact moment, Thomas made a radically impulsive decision, one that completely defied his normally calculated hyper-rational nature, but one that felt infinitely more right than anything he had done in years. He informed her that the large, beautifully built stone guest house at the far edge of his property had been sitting entirely empty for 2 years, and he insisted that she and David move in immediately, completely rent-free. He waved away her frantic, disbelieving protests, declaring that Sarah desperately needed a consistent friend, David needed a safe home, and the arrangement was the absolute least he could do for the woman who held his household together. As Jessica wept with overwhelming gratitude, Thomas felt an incredible, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, finally realizing that using his immense wealth to genuinely help someone brought him far more joy than any corporate victory ever could. The following weekend, the sprawling Greenwich estate saw a flurry of highly unusual activity, as the stone guest house was thoroughly cleaned, aired out, and completely furnished with brand-new items Thomas had personally ordered for them. Vincent took charge of coordinating the entire relocation, ensuring the walls received a fresh coat of warm paint, and that the pantry was fully stocked with nutritious food before the small family officially moved in on a bright Saturday morning. Jessica and David arrived with astonishingly few possessions, carrying only 2 small battered suitcases and a few flimsy cardboard boxes, a stark visual representation of the severe poverty they had been enduring for several long years. Thomas stood by the large bay window of his second-floor study, quietly observing the busy scene below, deeply moved by the sight of Jessica smiling brightly and expressing endless tearful gratitude for every small detail of her beautiful new home. He spent hours reflecting on the massive, impenetrable bubble of immense privilege he had constructed around himself, feeling a profound sense of deep guilt for having lived in such close proximity to desperate suffering without ever bothering to notice it. Sarah, however, was absolutely euphoric about the sudden change, spending her entire Saturday helping David unpack his few toys, and excitedly dragging him by the hand to show him every secret hiding spot scattered across the vast property. Over the next few weeks, Thomas began to notice a miraculous transformation in his own daughter. Noting how she had suddenly become incredibly communicative, bubbling with bright energy, and remarkably present in a way he had never seen before. Jessica's daily routine also shifted dramatically. No longer forced to endure hours on unreliable public transportation, she arrived at the main house earlier and stayed much later, her warm presence bringing a vibrant, comforting energy to the previously sterile mansion. Thomas found himself frequently pausing in the wide hallways just to listen to her softly singing while she prepared meals, noticing how her posture had completely relaxed and how quickly she smiled, carrying a beautiful lightness that simply hadn't existed before. He began to intentionally seek out her quiet company, finding subtle excuses to wander into the room she was working in, not fully understanding the strange gravitational pull he felt toward her, only knowing that seeing her happy brought him immense peace. One evening, after staying unusually late in his home office to review a complex corporate merger, Thomas heard a symphony of loud laughter and clattering bowls echoing up the grand staircase from the massive chef's kitchen. He immediately abandoned his heavy paperwork and followed the delightful noise, discovering Jessica standing at the massive marble island, patiently teaching Sarah and David how to properly mix the ingredients for a rich, decadent chocolate cake. Both children had their hands completely covered in white flour and sticky cocoa powder, giggling uncontrollably as Jessica gently guided their messy hands, her own face smudged with flour and glowing with genuine, wonderfully relaxed joy. Thomas froze in the kitchen doorway, utterly captivated by this beautifully chaotic domestic scene, feeling a sharp, unexpected pang of deep envy because he had never experienced a true family environment, having spent his life mistaking silent luxury for actual success. The moment Sarah spotted him lingering quietly in the shadows, she excitedly screamed for her father to come join them, a bold request that initially made him freeze with hesitation, as he had absolutely no idea how to bake anything. Jessica turned toward him, her bright green eyes sparkling with warm amusement, and gently encouraged him to step into the kitchen, warmly promising there was more than enough room for one more baker at the kitchen island. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Thomas found himself shrugging off his expensive tailored suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt, and literally plunging his hands into the messy reality of family life. When he struggled to fold the thick batter correctly, Jessica stepped up right beside him, her small, capable hand gently covering his larger one to perfectly demonstrate the correct motion, and the sudden warm physical contact sent an intense electric shock straight up his arm. They both froze, looking deeply into each other's eyes for a second that stretched far longer than appropriate, the air between them incredibly thick with unspoken tension, before Jessica quickly pulled her hand back, her cheeks burning with a deep, furious blush. The resulting chocolate cake came out of the oven completely lopsided and noticeably burned around the edges, but they sat together around the informal kitchen table and ate massive slices of it anyway, sharing wonderful stories and laughing until their sides ached. Sitting there, surrounded by the joyful noise of the children and the warm, radiant presence of the beautiful woman sitting across from him, Thomas genuinely could not remember the last time he had felt so incredibly alive, grounded, and perfectly content. Sarah, speaking rapidly with a mouthful of messy chocolate cake, suddenly asked if Jessica and David could eat dinner with them every single night from now on, prompting Jessica to instantly panic and attempt to politely decline the overly generous invitation. Thomas smoothly interrupted her, his deep voice firm but incredibly warm, stating that the giant house was far too empty, and that since they were all essentially living together on the estate, they should absolutely share their evening meals as a family. Jessica's eyes immediately welled up with thick, emotional tears, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated happiness, and she simply nodded her head in agreement, entirely incapable of forming the actual words to express her profound gratitude. Sarah leaped out of her chair, throwing her sticky arms around her father's neck and squeezing him tightly proudly, declaring to the entire room that he was undeniably the absolute greatest father in the entire world. In the wonderful weeks that followed, these shared family dinners became the absolute highlight of his long day, prompting him to intentionally leave his high-pressure downtown office hours early, just to ensure he was sitting at the table when the delicious food was served. He quickly discovered that Jessica was not only an extraordinary cook, but a fiercely intelligent woman with brilliant opinions on global politics and childhood education, leaving him eagerly counting down the hours each day until he could hear her voice again. David also began to naturally open up more eventually, starting to address his wealthy benefactor affectionately as Uncle Thomas, without anyone ever suggesting it, a beautiful progression that melted another heavy layer of ice around Thomas's guarded heart. Thomas soon realized he was becoming just as fiercely attached to the quiet, observant boy as he was to his own biological daughter, recognizing that the four of them were naturally weaving themselves into a tight, absolutely unbreakable familial unit. This incredible feeling of belonging was entirely new to him, completely redefining his rigid understanding of what made a house truly feel like a safe, welcoming home. Driven by this incredible new desire for deep connection, Thomas woke up one sunny Sunday morning and impulsively decided to take the entire household to the massive public park situated in the very center of Greenwich. He rented several bicycles, bought oversized bags of buttery popcorn and towering cones of melting ice cream, and eventually settled comfortably onto a shaded wooden bench, while the two exhausted children ran off to conquer the massive wooden playground structure. Jessica sat closely beside him on the quiet bench, the warm summer breeze playfully tossing her hair, and they fell into an incredibly easy, profound conversation about their childhoods, their simplest joys, and the heavy burdens they both secretly carried. Without meaning to, Thomas found himself completely spilling the darkest, most closely guarded secrets of his life, talking openly about his ex-wife's sudden departure, the crippling loneliness of his massive house, and his terrifying fear that he was inherently broken. Jessica sat in perfect silence, offering absolutely no judgment or unsolicited advice, simply listening with that rare, profound empathy that seemed to radiate from her very core, making him feel entirely seen and accepted for the very first time in his life. When she slowly reached out and placed her soft hand firmly over his in a beautiful gesture of pure comfort, a powerful jolt of electricity surged through his entire body, forcing him to finally admit the terrifying truth: he was completely falling in love. Jessica broke the companionable silence, her voice barely above a gentle whisper, softly asking him why he had never even attempted to find true love again after Sarah's mother had so callously walked out of their lives all those years ago. Thomas took a long, shaky breath, staring out at the children playing happily in the distance, and honestly confessed that his brutal divorce had convinced him he simply did not deserve to be happy or deeply loved by anyone ever again. He explained that he had buried his crushing sense of failure under mountains of corporate contracts, convincing himself that providing massive financial security for his daughter was an entirely acceptable substitute for actual emotional presence and romantic fulfillment. Jessica turned her head to look directly into his eyes, stating with fierce, unshakable conviction that he absolutely deserved to experience profound happiness and true unconditional love from a wonderful partner who would cherish him completely. Those incredibly sincere words pierced straight through the heavy corporate armor he had worn for several long years, prompting him to truly look at the magnificent woman sitting beside him, the woman who had unexpectedly turned his entire existence upside down. He leaned in slightly, his voice thick with raw emotion, and told her that she also deserved a beautiful life, that she deserved a strong man who would genuinely cherish her and David, someone who truly recognized exactly how uniquely spectacular she was. A deep crimson blush spread rapidly across Jessica's cheeks, and she shyly averted her eyes, but a small, incredibly genuine smile tugged at the corners of her mouth as they sat there shoulder to shoulder, peacefully watching their children laugh together. In that quiet, unassuming moment on a public park bench, breathing in the fresh scent of cut grass and warm sunshine, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that this was undeniably one of the happiest, most perfect days he had ever experienced. As the summer months slowly transitioned into crisp autumn, the daily routine within the massive estate fundamentally changed, replaced by the constant echoes of running footsteps, boisterous arguments over board games, and incredibly loud, joyful family dinners. Thomas found himself actively delegating crucial corporate responsibilities to his vice presidents, eager to escape the stressful boardroom, so he could rush home and spend quality time with the beautiful, chaotic family that had miraculously formed under his roof. He also noticed subtle, thrilling changes in Jessica. She held his gaze a little longer than necessary, found excuses to linger in his study when bringing him coffee, and blushed furiously whenever he openly complimented her brilliant mind or her infectious laugh. One unseasonably warm evening, long after Vincent had retired to his quarters and the children were fast asleep, Thomas and Jessica found themselves sitting entirely alone on the expansive back porch, sharing an expensive bottle of wine under the soft, glowing lanterns. Thomas watched the gentle breeze catch the loose strands of her hair, completely mesmerized by her natural beauty, and before he could stop himself, the heavy truth finally spilled from his lips, telling her that he needed to confess something incredibly important. He looked into her expectant green eyes and poured his heart out, telling her that she had fundamentally resurrected his deadened spirit, bringing brilliant light to his dark home and teaching his lonely daughter how to truly be a happy child. Jessica reached out, gently cupping his face with a breathtaking tenderness that nearly brought him to tears, confessing that she felt the exact same profound connection, but admitting she was terrified of the massive power imbalance and the vicious societal judgment they would face. Thomas firmly covered her hand with his own, pressing it intimately against his cheek, and fiercely declared that he cared absolutely nothing for society's toxic opinions, stating clearly that he no longer wanted her as an employee, but as his equal lifelong partner. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, asking if he was truly certain. And when he promised he had never been more certain of anything in his entire life, he leaned in, slowly capturing her lips, in a soft, incredibly passionate kiss. In the glorious days immediately following that life-altering kiss on the porch, Thomas and Jessica sat the children down in the living room and gently explained that their relationship had successfully evolved, officially confirming that they were now a committed couple. Sarah was so incredibly thrilled by the wonderful news that she literally jumped up and down, screaming at the top of her lungs that she had secretly known all along that her father was deeply in love with her favorite person. David absorbed the information much more quietly, his young mind processing the gravity of the shift, before he walked over and wrapped his arms tightly around Thomas's waist softly, thanking the older man for promising to fiercely protect his beloved mother. Exactly 1 year after that fateful afternoon, when he had found the children dancing, Thomas completely rented out the most exclusive romantic restaurant in downtown Greenwich, taking Jessica out for a private, candle-lit dinner to celebrate their extraordinary journey. She looked absolutely breathtaking, sitting across from him, wearing a remarkably elegant yet beautifully simple emerald dress that perfectly matched the stunning color of her eyes, completely unaware of the massive diamond ring burning a hole in his tailored suit pocket. Thomas reached across the crisp white tablecloth, gently taking both of her hands in his, and softly asked her to marry him, a question that caused Jessica to cover her mouth and burst into immediate joyful tears as she eagerly accepted. The beautiful promise of forever hovered in the air between them, completely solidifying the magnificent reality that they had bravely conquered their fears and built an incredible life together. The wedding was an incredibly intimate, deeply moving ceremony held right in the center of their sprawling, flower-filled backyard, attended only by their truest friends, Jessica's proud parents, and the loyal employees who had truly become their chosen family. Sarah proudly served as the most enthusiastic bridesmaid in history, while David stood tall at the altar as the ring-bearer, both children beaming with uncontrollable joy as they watched the two people they loved most formalize their beautiful union. Following the beautiful ceremony, the newly formed family officially consolidated their entire lives. Jessica and David moved all of their personal belongings out of the stone guest house and into the massive master suites of the main mansion. With her financial future permanently secured, Jessica finally laid down her cleaning supplies and eagerly enrolled in a prestigious university to study business administration, fiercely determined to build the professional career she had always dreamed of but could never afford to pursue. Thomas supported her academic ambitions with overwhelming enthusiasm, frequently hiring private tutors when she needed them, and constantly reminding her of her brilliant potential, thrilled to watch his intelligent, capable wife conquer complex textbooks. A few wonderful months into their marriage, an incredibly profound milestone occurred when David casually referred to Thomas as his dad during a loud family dinner, causing the entire room to fall completely silent before Thomas swept the boy into a massive hug. That beautiful slip of the tongue prompted Thomas to immediately contact his aggressive corporate lawyers, initiating the highly complex legal process to officially permanently adopt David, ensuring the boy would legally share his last name and his extensive family legacy. The spectacular day, the severe courtroom judge finally banged the wooden gavel, officially declaring them legal father and son, ranked as one of the most intensely emotional days of Thomas's entire existence, completely cementing the reality that love conquers biology. The subsequent years flowed by with incredible speed, and immense joy. An undeniable truth that struck Thomas powerfully one ordinary Saturday morning as he lay in his massive bed, quietly watching the early sunlight illuminate Jessica's beautifully peaceful sleeping face. Sarah and David were now vibrant, energetic 10-year-olds, completely inseparable in every aspect of their busy lives. Despite lacking any shared biological traits, they functioned perfectly as twins, constantly studying together and fiercely defending one another against any outside threats. Jessica had triumphantly graduated with her business administration degree the previous year and immediately stepped into a powerful leadership role within Thomas's massive company, specifically taking total control of the incredibly complex human resources department to initiate sweeping revolutionary changes. She successfully implemented incredible initiatives, drastically increasing the base salaries of the lowest-paid workers, creating a massive scholarship fund exclusively for the employees' children, and building a state-of-the-art daycare center directly inside the corporate headquarters. Watching her beautifully transform his ruthless company into a beacon of immense compassion made Thomas incredibly proud, completely validating his absolute certainty that choosing her was the greatest, most profoundly impactful decision he had ever made in his long life. During a massive summer barbecue held at the sprawling estate, the yard was filled with the loud sounds of clinking glasses, roaring laughter, and dozens of children sprinting wildly across the manicured lawns, while the massive grills smoked heavily. Suddenly, Jessica appeared at Thomas's side, gently touching his arm and asking to speak with him privately, her face displaying a highly unusual, nervous expression that instantly sent a sharp spike of deep concern directly into Thomas's fiercely protective heart. When they safely reached the quiet sanctuary of his private oak-paneled study, she took a long, shaky breath, her hands nervously twisting together as she quietly revealed that she was actually pregnant, and that they were going to have a brand new baby. An explosive wave of pure, unadulterated ecstasy washed over Thomas, and he let out a loud, joyous shout, pulling his beloved wife into a crushing embrace and spinning her wildly around the quiet room, tears of pure happiness streaming down his face. They eagerly shared the spectacular news with Sarah and David, who were incredibly thrilled to become older siblings, and the subsequent months of the delicate pregnancy seemed to fly by in an absolute blur of joyful anticipation and careful preparations. The peaceful waiting period ended violently in the absolute dead of night when Thomas was abruptly jolted awake by Jessica's frantic grip on his shoulder, gasping out in intense pain that her water had just broken and the baby was coming. He grabbed the meticulously packed hospital bag and sped toward the absolute best hospital in Connecticut, his heart hammering violently against his ribs, while he simultaneously held Jessica's sweating hand, loudly coaching her through the intense breathing exercises. After a grueling labor that stretched on for 6 agonizing hours, the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn baby boy shattered the tense silence of the sterile delivery room, causing Thomas's knees to violently buckle with sheer, overwhelming relief. The incredibly exhausted but radiant Jessica held the perfectly healthy infant tightly to her chest, and they quickly agreed to name the beautiful child Michael, a strong, classic name that perfectly suited the brand-new addition to their incredible family. When Sarah and David arrived at the hospital the next morning to carefully hold their tiny new brother Thomas, watched them interact, feeling an immense, powerful wave of absolute gratitude wash over his entirely full soul. The initial months following Michael's arrival brought a chaotic, exhausting reality to the massive estate, as the newborn woke constantly throughout the dead of night, demanding relentless attention and filling the once quiet halls with loud, demanding cries that tested everyone's profound patience. Yet Thomas and Jessica tackled the severe sleep deprivation as a completely unified team, seamlessly taking turns walking the dark hallways with the crying infant, deeply anchoring their growing family in a beautiful routine of shared sacrifice. Michael grew at an astonishing rate, soon transforming from a completely helpless infant into a remarkably fast crawler, rapidly navigating the expensive carpets and constantly attempting to put absolutely every dangerous object he could find directly into his tiny, curious mouth. The older siblings essentially became his fiercely dedicated personal bodyguards, constantly sprinting across the vast house to intercept him before he could pull heavy lamps down or tumble dangerously down the grand staircases, filling the massive home with constant, vibrant life. Thomas would frequently stand on the high balcony overlooking the grand living room, quietly watching his three entirely different children interact, feeling his chest physically ache with the sheer magnitude of the immense love he felt for this brilliantly unconventional family. Every single loud argument, every joyful laugh, and every quiet moment of shared peace proved to him that opening his heavily guarded heart had been the absolute greatest victory of his entire existence. The massive mansion, which had once felt like a terrifyingly lonely, echoing tomb of corporate isolation, was now completely overflowing with genuine warmth, solidifying his belief that true happiness is ultimately found in the messy, beautiful reality of shared human connection. The incredibly strong protective bubble they had built around their blended family was violently pierced when Sarah turned 12 years old and arrived home from her elite school, completely devastated, slamming her bedroom door and refusing to speak to anyone. Thomas gently coaxed his way into her room, finding his beautiful daughter sobbing uncontrollably into her pillows, eventually confessing that several cruel classmates had viciously mocked her, claiming Jessica wasn't her real mother and her brothers were entirely fake. A hot, violent surge of protective rage flooded Thomas's veins, but he forced himself to remain perfectly calm, pulling his heartbroken daughter into a tight embrace and delivering a fierce, impassioned speech about the true, unbreakable nature of their unique family. He firmly explained that true family is never defined by simple genetics, but by the relentless daily choice to show up, to protect, and to love unconditionally, reminding her that Jessica and David actively chose to love her every single day. When Jessica later learned of the cruel incident she held, Sarah tightly, fiercely declaring that while she had not carried her in her womb, she carried her deeply in her soul, permanently cementing their powerful mother-daughter bond against any outside cruelty. A year later, their blended family faced another major test, when 13-year-old David revealed that his biological father, the man who had abandoned Jessica during her pregnancy, had found him and requested a meeting. Though terrified of losing the son he had raised and adopted, Thomas assured David that the choice was entirely his and promised to stand beside him. At the meeting, David calmly accepted the apology, but made it clear he had no desire to build a relationship with a stranger. Holding Thomas's hand, he declared that he already had the best father he could ever ask for finally leaving the pain of his past behind and strengthening the unbreakable bond of their chosen family. As the years passed, Michael grew into a compassionate young man. Sarah became a dedicated pediatrician. David pursued civil engineering, and Jessica's visionary leadership earned national recognition before Thomas entrusted her with his business and retired. He spent his later years celebrating his children's marriages, welcoming grandchildren, and enjoying a life filled with love until his peaceful passing at 83, surrounded by family. His story proved that true wealth is measured not by money or status, but by empathy, unconditional love, and the daily decision to protect and cherish one another, leaving behind a lasting legacy of a family united by choice rather than blood.